Hey, welcome into the Husker247 Podcast. As promised, I wanted to get to some recruiting here on the podcast as well. So, today you're going to get me, Mike Schaefer, talking with Michael Bruntz about Nebraska's Elite Day. First, let's start with that. Bruntz, how do you feel about Nebraska Elite Day instead of Junior Day? Or how do you just feel about the word elite being used as often as it gets used?
I don't have strong feelings on the use of elite.
You're not PJ Fleck in this scenario where you're going to try to use it 37 times in a 3 minute
no.
monologue.
Matt Rule uses it a fair amount too.
Matt Rule is a big elite guy. I wonder if he and Fleck have talked about that.
I don't know. I know that Matt Rule does not require his people to say elite though, which I know takes place in Minnesota. But no, it's probably the use of elite is probably indicative of a change, I guess, in the way that Nebraska's maybe approaching junior days. Is that fair? Like less of the 60 guy cattle call type junior days and more of a what I would consider more of a focused group. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think maybe less polite way to say it is there's not much filler here. These are guys that Nebraska is bringing in because in a lot of ways they want to kind of open the door to what the University of Nebraska and its football is all about, and then try to get a number of them back for official visits or spring visits and then official visits and then a game day visit. So it's an opportunity to really kind of showcase that you can attract elite talent, that you can have a specific day for specific highly recruited players. And they've got a pretty good list, I think, put together here. I find it remarkable that there's guys coming in from Arizona, Idaho, Florida, Michigan. You've got a number of different states represented. Baltimore, Maryland is on the list here. I mean, so Georgia.
Idaho.
Yeah. Fruitland, Idaho, which I have researched where it is, and it is not where I thought it would be at all, as it falls like right on that Oregon-Idaho border. So, yeah, and Kelvin Obit, the offensive lineman from Fruitland, Nebraska first stopped by and saw him earlier this week, but he's also one of the few guys that has been out here to see Nebraska before. I mean, Jace Reynolds, obviously the in-state recruit from Elkhorn North, has been here before. Cason Thomas, the linebacker from Sioux City, Heelan, has been here before. But Kelvin Obit is one of the few out of the area guys that this isn't the first visit. And Nebraska was just there this week. So I think they've got some real momentum there. Let's just kind of walk through this a little bit. I have some questions for you that I think will prompt some interesting conversation. But let's kind of go through this list just a little bit. And why don't you throw out 2-3 guys that stand out to you off of this list so far and kind of what you make of what it appears Nebraska is targeting heavily in 2026.
Yeah, I mean, we probably start with linemen, right? Like, I mean, we kind of we kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but I think getting Obit back that stands out to me. It's Rex Waterman, another offensive lineman from Arizona. I mean, those are two names that stand out immediately to me as, in part because Matt Rule saw them this week. Like it feels like there's a little bit of momentum there, like you said. I mean, I think when you can go anywhere in the country and you go to see this person, and you're going to turn around and see them again and host them that weekend. That seems noteworthy to me. Am I grasping at straws there?
No, I think first, this list has several offensive linemen on it. And so I think that's notable. I think it's obvious Nebraska wants to leave the 2026 class with a handful of tackles that they would love to develop over time so they don't have to play transfer portal games to try to add to their offensive line. But yeah, Kelvin Obit and Rex Waterman both got visits from Matt Rule and various assistant coaches this week. I think it was Matt Rule and Donovan Raiola were down to see Waterman in suburban Phoenix. And then I think it was Marcus Satterfield and Matt Rule that saw Kelvin Obit up in Idaho. And so I think some of that is just you're sending Raiola to other areas to try to, really build out your offensive line recruiting. Some of it is Idaho might be part of Marcus Satterfield's territory that he recruits, as he also has Colorado, and he might just sort of be in that run of things over there. But it's big to me that they went and saw these guys. I know from talking with Rex Waterman, it was a huge part of him coming out this weekend is Nebraska made a point to come see him. And not just made a point to come see him, like the head coach came and saw him. And so for Rex Waterman, this is a visit where things could move pretty quickly, and he might be locking in an official visit while he's sitting in the office talking with the coaching staff this weekend. I don't know that it'll go beyond that because I think he has some interest from other schools that he is also interested in. But Nebraska certainly impressed him, and he's one of those guys that is a little bit deeper down the list, but he would be a nice addition to add to your room to try to develop over time. And then Kelvin Obit, I think, is a much bigger target for Nebraska. And you're talking about having to beat out Oregon. I know that the California schools are in the mix there. You also have schools like Michigan and SEC schools coming out to Idaho because this guy is that talented. And so a Kelvin Obit, that's going to be a battle. And I think both of those guys are a great example of you want to be able to recruit on a couple different levels. I mean, you get a Rex Waterman in the class, that doesn't mean you've solved the offensive tackle picture. But if you keep stacking talent, then you're setting yourself up in case some guy decides to leave in the portal later on. Or if Rex Waterman or whomever, you put whatever name you want on a developmental tackle, develops nicely in the first couple years, he might jump the depth chart a little bit. So I think you always want to stack numbers, and Nebraska's gotten a little thin at tackle, and I think they're really trying to hit that hard in this 2026 cycle.
What other lineman on that list? Claude Mpuma, out of the Chicago area. Kind of an intriguing kid. He's been at Nebraska before. He came down for a game, and he's really raw. Started playing football.
Very new to football. Just started playing football. Junior.
As a junior, was a basketball player. We list him at 6'7", 308. He's the number 27 offensive tackle in the country, according to 247 Sports in the 2026 class. He's coming for a multi-day visit. I think we can probably dovetail into a conversation too about Nebraska's efforts in Illinois. That seems to be a state that they've targeted in recent years to, really kind of make more of an effort with, and you're getting the return visits now. Mikhail Blade, the 4-star,
what a name,
all name team, edge rusher out of Chicago, also coming in this weekend. But within Puma, you've got a kind of a raw, just really high upside kid that, Nebraska seems to be at least getting in with quite nicely if he's coming for that much time this weekend. It's a nice little offensive line group. I mean, I think he's kind of the next addition to that group, but maybe not somebody that's as developed, but you got to like those measurables. You also have to like an offensive tackle that's played basketball, because the feet are probably going to be there too.
Yeah, he's super, super raw, but there's a lot of projection there. And the athleticism, like you're talking about with the footwork, seems to be something that guys really like to transfer over. I mean, we've certainly talked to enough Nebraska offensive line coaches throughout the years here that we know they like guys that play basketball or guys that wrestle, because there's a lot of footwork that goes with that. And as much as you think of offensive line play as being big and strong and arms, a lot of it is getting your feet correctly set, getting your body in the right stance, being able to move out of a crouched position and doing it where it's second nature. So you want guys that be able to move like wrestlers or can move like basketball players or what have you. You want that athletic ability. Otherwise, if you're just really strong in the upper body but you have no footwork, you're going to be a disaster. And so that's definitely something that they're going to be looking at. Another offensive lineman, since we're just kind of rolling through the offensive line here, Edward Baker from St. Francis Academy. Now, Nebraska has not offered him. I suspect he'll be leaving with an offer. He's kind of a fascinating guy. St. Francis Academy is one of the big powerhouse prep schools in the country. They routinely play in those ESPN games like right before the season starts. I believe Nebraska's own Dylan Raiola played against St. Francis Academy on ESPN a couple years ago and had a really strong game, if I remember what Andrew Ivins was telling me on it. But Edward Baker is the left tackle for that St. Francis Academy team, but he's only 6'3.5". This is a guy that is ticketed for an interior offensive line future. He's only rated a 3-star by 247 Sports, but curiously, if you look at his offer list and who's been stopping by to see him, he's got some really big teams that have come in, elite teams, you might even say, if you were one to use the word. And Alabama kind of leads the way there, and that's a school to sort of watch for Ed Baker. But he's really excited about Nebraska. It sounds like Nebraska has done a nice job really kind of talking it up as a place that's worth their time to come visit. He wants to see the facilities. He wants to spend more time with the coaching staff. That's a guy that I anticipate will leave with an offer. He's coming with some teammates. Not the biggest names on that team, but if you subscribe to former defensive coordinator Tony White's idea that you got to get guys in who will go back and talk in their area about what they saw in Nebraska, that might help get a Jerah Edwards or a Zion Ely, the two top guys at St. Francis Academy, that tentatively were thinking about coming out to visit Nebraska, but Edwards is going to go to Georgia, and Ely, who's committed to Maryland in the loosest of senses, is doing nothing this weekend instead. So maybe if it gets back to him how great the visit was to Nebraska this spring, the same contingent potentially comes back out for a practice. I think that's already kind of loosely been discussed as well. So Edward Baker, a name to know there. Bruntz, I kind of want to shift this. We've run through a lot of the offensive linemen. I want to shift this, and there's a couple different positions here, but it is kind of fascinating. Like with Matt Rule, we spend so much time talking Texas, Pennsylvania, Texas. Look at the guys that are coming in from Florida.
Yeah.
And look at the sort of success they've had. They have some notable guys on their roster that are from Florida, from Miami specifically. They've got a Miami commit and Jordan Campbell coming out. That's a linebacker. He's a top 247 player in the 2026 rankings. Another guy who's loosely committed to the Hurricanes. He's been committed for a while, but he has also taken visits to Alabama, to Auburn, to a bunch of different places. And so he's coming out to see Nebraska. He's got a great relationship with the coaching staff. Phil Simpson's done a really nice job recruiting down there. John Butler has connections down in Florida and seems to be all over that state in the month of January. Obviously, Addison Williams has connections, having coached at UCF. Matt Rule spent some time down in Florida, including visiting with Jordan Campbell. He's not the only one, but let's just stop there before we kind of go through some of the names that are the defensive backs. What do you think about Nebraska's efforts going hard into Florida? And it's not that they're not also pursuing players in Texas, but it does feel like it's shifted a little bit where they have maybe the smallest of footholds in Miami and surrounding communities.
Yeah, there's been a lot of investment there. I think Phil Simpson, especially, I mean, he's kind of the headliner down there right now. I mean, Evan Cooper had a lot of connections in Florida. And when he departed, it was kind of like, well, what does that mean for Nebraska now? Getting Phil Simpson on staff is huge. I think basically traversed the state in the last couple of weeks. Was in Jacksonville, was in Orlando.
He was in Duval County.
Was in Duval. A lot of time in Miami. Rob Dvorak was down there as well, in addition to everybody you named. And I think when you hear Matt Rule talk about players from Florida, I think there's an appreciation for guys like Cortez Mills, guys like Ja'Cory Barney, guys like Vincent Shavers, who are just kind of wired a little bit differently. Like, I go back to what Matt Rule was asked about it. I think it was the first signing day, and it's just a little bit competitive. It means a little bit more down there to guys. It's as much talent as there is down there. It's a small football community where
everyone knows everyone.
Yeah, and I think if you can pull the right guys out of there, and I think having guys from South Florida that have had success under Matt Rule so far at Nebraska, I think that helps a ton in terms of kind of sowing the seeds for future classes. So, yeah, I mean, when you kind of look at the locations of where guys are from that are coming in this weekend, I mean, it does stand out how many guys are from Florida. I mean, and that's, you saw it under Scott Frost that they had some success. It was tough to get guys to stay. COVID was part of that, but I think Matt Rule feels like they've got something there. And it is noteworthy, you're right, that, while everybody was going to work in Florida, it was basically Jamar Mosey that was down in Texas kind of making rounds in the state, making offers. And I think you have to continue to do things down there. But I think when you kind of track where guys have been, it's Florida. There was a lot of Georgia. Nebraska spent more time than I would have expected in Mississippi. Matt Rule was in Louisiana this past week. That there's definitely been a little bit of a shift, I think, in kind of where things are, where they're kind of looking down there right now. And I think part of that is you just have, it feels like, more background of success in the state than what you had a year ago with the freshmen that came up and played. And also just there's more connections on the staff right now, I think, in that part of the country than there is in Texas. I mean, if you look at the people that have left the staff and moved on, it was people whose responsibility was Texas, and it's people that had ties in Texas, like the Garrett McGuires, and Terrence Knighton was the Houston guy. And Nebraska, I think, kind of maybe quietly has recruited a little bit more lightly in the Dallas area as well.
Yeah, I think that's an astute observation. And it's not just the Georgia, Florida. You mentioned Mississippi. They spent more time in the Carolinas. They have some traction in the Carolinas. They certainly put a lot of effort into kind of that Chesapeake region where they're in Virginia, they're in Maryland. We know that they've recruited in the Northeast. I don't think they anticipate they're going to pull a player out of all of these areas, but I think they want to go where they think they have some connection. They want to kind of build and get guys out to take visits when they're juniors or sophomores or what have you. I think if we look back at some of the visit lists, they've had guys from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, along the eastern seaboard for just games this past fall. And that's not always been the case. And so I am kind of curious how that continues. I know E.J. Barthel has some connections along the East Coast, and he's sort of the guy that was recruiting over there for Nebraska. But it will be interesting to see how that all goes. The one name that he popped up every now and then when recruits have put him out, but has been operating in silence in a way that we're not used to from wide receiver coaches. Daikiel Shorts has quietly been out there doing something. And I don't know what that is exactly, but it is kind of fascinating that like wide receiver has been this sort of very public Nebraska fawning over needing to get wide receivers and being involved in some big targets and some of it was Garrett McGuire was pretty good with the social media game and you kind of knew where he was at and all of that. Daikiel Shorts is a little more quiet with it, and I can't really point you in the direction of specific wide receivers in the way that I can other positions. And that kind of stands out to me a little bit too. It's always fascinating when there's coaching changes and you sort of pick up on the different personalities of how these guys are. Like Phil Simpson, we knew what schools he was going to. We knew what counties he was spending time in. Sometimes we would know what he was eating. So you have that aspect of it. But then you have Daikiel Shorts over here, and you're not entirely sure where he's at. Addison Williams is popping up, not so much because of his own tweets, but because he's just in photos with a bunch of different defensive backs. And I think he's become a pretty popular guy. I'm excited to get to know more about him. And I've got kind of a framework of a story from just talking to different recruits and coaches down in Florida about that guy. But it is kind of fascinating when you track some of that, where everybody is appearing or where they aren't appearing. And then you have the other end of the spectrum where, I kid you not, I think Marcus Satterfield has seen like 72 tight ends since the start of the visit period, and Nebraska has offered at least 36 of those.
Well, and as we know, that's what Nebraska produces now too. I mean, it's
and none of them are in state.
I know
they have seen Isaac Jensen, and he is. It's going to be a quiet year in state, and it might be a quiet few years in state. I think the 105. I think the sort of the end of the NIL scholarship, if you will. I think Nebraska maybe learned some lessons on taking players from we can do this because we have the room, we can do this because of the optics, and it just didn't work out. I don't look for them to go heavy in state as much as they did initially.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think the 105 kind of eliminates the do we not conversation and oh, maybe we do because it's a local kid.
Yeah.
I think that's always going to be part of the conversation, and I think it's going to be fascinating to see how locally that's responded to, because it's just the reality of college football nowadays. But yeah, the tight end piece of it's always kind of fun, because it's guys that are really good athletes. I think you've seen, especially regionally, Nebraska's offered tight ends in Colorado, South Dakota, in Iowa. You've got the tight end. Probably kind of
that offers out in Kansas and Missouri as well.
Lincoln Watkins, tight end, Michigan's coming in this weekend. So, and that's a group that, as of right now, you don't have a lot of guys just kind of waiting in the wings as like the next guy up. So that'll be interesting to follow. But yeah, it's the last month has been kind of interesting to track, because it's felt like Nebraska has had certain assistant coaches cover more ground geographically than I can really recall. But doing it for very specific prospects, not just kind of like stopping through an area and just doing it to show some face.
Yeah, I think Matt Rule, who will talk on Saturday, we're recording this on Friday, it'll air on Friday. I have no idea when you'll listen to it. But on Saturday, Matt Rule will talk, and I'm sure he's going to get asked about how he feels like the first year of having just one visit period, but not having to do in-homes with your commits. I mean, it's a very different style that they've been able to kind of go about. And they're doing in-homes with juniors. And so it'll be interesting how he feels about the recruiting aspect of this, how it went, what they learned from it, and where they kind of go moving forward. I want to dive back into this visit list because there's several defensive backs here that I think are really interesting. Several from Florida. You've got Devin Jackson, who's committed to the University of Florida, and Danny Odom. These are two guys that fit what you're talking about in terms of Florida and competitiveness. Talking with their 7-on-7 coach, that's how he would basically describe these two. He said that's what Addison Williams was talking to them about. They want guys that aren't afraid to compete. They want guys who play football and think about football and talk football all the time. And that really describes Devin Jackson and Danny Odom and Dominic Turnbull, the third one of these. Odom, Turnbull are your corners. Jackson's more likely a safety, though he could play corner. And I think both Odom and Turnbull are pretty high up on the list for Nebraska on their defensive backboard. So getting those guys in early is a big thing. And they're both, with Odom and Turnbull, Bruntz, they're pretty interesting in that they're about the same size. They're in that 6'1" to 6'2" range, going to be about 185 pounds as they come in. When they get to a college, someone's going to try to put the weight on them, not too much, but you want them to be physical out there. But Nebraska's certainly looking for the long-armed, big, tall corner once again. And so the defensive back room that has changed over a ton, where they have a lot of questions, where they're going to have to make some critical cuts in this offseason, they are certainly focused on trying to bring in several corners. And that is an area, cornerback specifically, where Nebraska hasn't hit on a big name in quite some time.
Yeah, well, and it's, kind of learning again what a defensive backs coach is looking for in that group.
Right.
I mean, we've done the exercise of naming all the defensive backs coaches, did the personal sporkle, and we'll see kind of what Addison Williams values in that backfield and how that ultimately takes shape. And yes, it's a large group. There's going to be a lot of change coming to that group, but you also have to find guys that are ready to kind of come in and compete to kind of be that next group in. And you're right, like it's especially at corner, it's felt like you haven't had guys that are kind of like the true cornerbacks that like out of high school. It's been a lot of maybe a safety, maybe a corner. We'll see when he gets here. I think you're right that both of those guys are much more in kind of the true corner type profile than maybe what Nebraska's recruited recently.
And this is just more of a me thing. It would be nice if Addison Williams was less focused on trying to find guys that can play both positions to create depth and more interested in just getting the best pure cornerbacks that he can. I do feel like that's a trapping that Travis Fisher and Evan Cooper were both sort of involved. And some of that is necessity, right? Like you're bringing in defensive backs and you're at some point injuries or whatever hit, and you just trust this veteran to be able to slide over to corner more than you do putting out a young corner. But I feel like they've had some mixed returns on trying to get guys that can sort of handle both, because it seems like they're not particularly good at either. Is that fair?
No, that's fair. And I think sometimes, and this isn't just true of defensive backs, I think it's true of a lot of positions, but if you start moving around a lot, that's usually that's kind of the death knell for, where a guy ultimately develops.
You mean when a tight end becomes an outside linebacker, it usually doesn't result in starting on the defense?
Putting weight on that tight end and moving him to defensive end is usually that's a recipe to get buried on the depth chart.
We only have like 6-7 examples. I mean, it's not like we have that much to work with here.
Yeah.
But anything else you want to get in recruiting wise? Anything else that stands out to you from this weekend?
No, I'm eager to kind of see what the returns are and kind of what the reviews are of the visit. I mean, I'm sure everything's going to be great. Fantastic.
Do you think they're going to have a cooking class?
It's part of the deal, right? Like it's been part of it. So it's unique. And for what Nebraska, spends to feed athletes, it's something worth highlighting. But I don't know.
Do you think if we asked politely, they'd let us go through the cooking class? Obviously, when the recruits aren't there, but do you think they would do a media cooking session?
Well, they did.
When was this?
You apparently weren't invited.
It
was when they were doing the introductions to everybody on the staff. They had a little
Was this
hangout.
Was I on leave during this time?
You might have been. I think BC was part of it, so you could ask him. But he wowed him with his tortellini soup.
No, I was gonna say BC's probably over there. Like, I don't want to make pasta. I want to make soup.
Yeah, it's soup season. So I don't know. I mean, it's where junior days kind of fit in now to like the new recruiting calendar, which I mean, it feels like there's been a big shift in the last year with the portal. Just things getting sped up. I think teams kind of figuring out how to better use official visits in the spring. I'm eager to kind of see if Nebraska is able to make some hay here and get quick returns from some of these guys for official visits.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting period kind of going forward. And then, of course, when the visit contact period ends and the dead period resumes, it's going to get quiet again. They're obviously going to have phone calls and messages and all of that, and visits will get set up. But there is going to be a little bit of a lull, and then it will pick up big in the spring. If there's one takeaway I have from last year, it was Nebraska did a fantastic job getting a lot of its preferred targets in for spring practices. They really pushed and emphasized wanting to get guys in for spring practices, and then some would double back for the spring game, and a lot came back for official visits. So it'll get quiet for a little bit, and then it's going to pick up real big in March when they start those practices again, and certainly in April as they build towards not necessarily a football game on April 26th.
It's going to be interesting to follow.
Certainly will be. All right. Well, if you want to follow Husker247, we would appreciate that. And you can do that at Husker247.com. We got all the coverage coming out of this weekend from the Elite visit that is happening on Saturday. Matt Rule is speaking on Saturday. We'll have coverage from that. Brian Christopherson was at Nebraska's upset win at home against Illinois last night, so we got coverage from that. And, of course, we'll have coverage of the Oregon game coming up. Baseball season is just around the bend, and that is Michael Bruntz's domain. He is going to be heavily involved in tracking how Nebraska baseball does with a brutal non-conference schedule. Real quickly, just give me 3 names that's on the non-con.
LSU, Vanderbilt, and Oregon State.
Oh, those seem like good teams. National title winner, and LSU hasn't won one in a bit, right?
I need to review. But yes, it's as tough as they've played in a long time. Nebraska.
Yeah. So that'll be a lot of fun. So we have all that coverage at Husker247.com. Get there and stick around for more podcast content next week as we return with the Husker 24/7 Hoopscast, the Husker 24/7 Podcast.